How do you contend with someone who knows everything about you, yet you know nothing about them? They know exactly where to strike you, but you don't even know where they're coming from. And what if the entire time you were being misled in one direction so that your back would be all the easier to stab? Originally appearing in his own titular storyline in the Batman comics from issues 608 to 619 in 2002, Hush has been one of the most recent and successful additions to the Dark Knight's expansive rogues gallery. This run of comics was written by Jeff Loeb with pencils by Jim Lee, and everyone involved with this storyline deserves credit for giving this character that initial spark. But I believe only after he was expanded upon in future iterations did he really come into his own as a villain. The original Hush storyline is a mystery revolving around the identity of said villain, who is targeting Batman from the shadows for unknown reasons. The art is fantastic, and the writing, involving Batman's relationship with Catwoman, as well as reflections on his entire history up to this point, is very well done. But the actual reveal and motivations of Hush himself is extremely weak, and I found myself in disbelief that that was all there was to it after so much build-up. So let's dig into it, starting with someone shooting out Batman's zipline while he's chasing after Catwoman. This sends him crashing down into the alley below, the same alley his parents were killed in, which inspired him to eventually become Batman. That's a convenient place to end up, too bad it's with a broken shoulder and fractured skull. Before anyone can take advantage of his incapacitated state, the Huntress arrives to save him, while sporting an upgraded set of gear for her operation. As Batman is driven away in his Batmobile, the camera pans out and we get our first glimpse of Hush watching the whole thing go down. He wears a brown trench coat with bandages wrapped around his head, concealing his identity. In a way, this look harkens back to old horror villains like the Invisible Man, which makes him feel at home with the themes of Batman and his other villains. It's my theory that anytime a series has a guy with his head wrapped in bandages, it's gonna have a ton of fans. It's a sick aesthetic, but maybe people secretly want a good Mummy movie to come out. Back at the Batcave, unable to speak, Batman uses Morse code to request they contact a childhood friend of his to help fix his head injury. This would be Thomas Elliot, who grew up alongside Bruce Wayne and eventually became one of the best neurosurgeons in the country. They grew apart as life took them in different directions, but now they're meeting again under intense circumstances. The surgery is a success, and we see Hush reacting angrily to that fact with a newspaper in his hands. The central idea of the story is that whoever Hush is, he's wearing Batman down by making his villains even more lethal. We see this with Killer Croc at the start of the story, who's going berserk due to being injected with some kind of mutagen he needs the cure for. Hush also gives Poison Ivy kryptonite lipstick, which lets her temporarily take over Superman's mind and use him as a weapon. This premise is pretty similar to that of the storyline of Nightfall, where the newly introduced Bane released all of Batman's foes from Arkham Asylum as a way to break his spirit before he breaks his body. The difference is we got to see Bane's thought process and his side of the story in real time. While with Hush, he's very much kept a mystery, but we get glimpses of him passing money around or watching his plan unfold from a distance. Oftentimes he's quoting the philosopher Aristotle, which does give him an air of sophistication, but does get old after a while, or begin to seem like an unnecessary additional gimmick, especially when he's forcing these quotes into conversations in later storylines he appears in, just to keep the bit running. I will say Nightfall also did a much better job showing just how emotionally distressed and exhausted Batman was becoming, with very expressive art. Thomas Elliot does show concern for his health, showing up at his mansion and even during a trip to Metropolis to make sure he's taking it easy after his head surgery. When Bruce has flashbacks to his childhood growing up with Thomas, who he calls Tommy, they're shown in this excellent watercolor style which gives these memories a dreamlike feel. Their friendship is a retcon, but it's done so well that you're sold on the idea that all of this happened. Together they shared many great memories, including spotting the original Green Lantern taking down a foe known as the Icicle. The two of them would often play a game of strategy together where Tommy would always win, urging Bruce to learn to think like his enemy. One night, Tommy came to the Wayne Manor soaking wet from the rain. His parents had been in a car crash and needed to be rushed to the emergency room. Bruce promised that his father, Thomas Wayne, who was a talented surgeon, would save Tommy's parents. But unfortunately, only his mother survived the ordeal, causing Tommy to punch Bruce in the face in anger. Now, grown up, Bruce and Tommy attend a play together, which ends up being attacked by Harley Quinn. As she robs the people in attendance, she attempts to take a jade pendant from Tommy's neck, which sets him off. This necklace was given to him by his mom, meant to represent life's endless march forward. She had died a decade after her husband after being diagnosed with terminal cancer. But even as a kid, he was extremely defensive of it, even attacking Bruce after he snatched it from him as a joke. Snap back to the current situation where he chases after Harley to get it back. By the time Bruce can follow them as Batman, he finds Tommy's dead body in an alley with a gunshot wound and the Joker perched above him. Batman is almost driven to kill the Joker, reflecting on everyone he's hurt. And I will say, even beyond the mystery of Hush himself, this whole story is great for new readers because it recaps so many moments from Batman's history in a digestible way, while also showcasing his various enemies and allies one by one, getting you invested in this world. Jim Gordon shows up to stop Batman from becoming a killer himself, and we pan up once again to see Hush watching from afar. Talking to himself, he claims Joker is innocent and didn't shoot Thomas Elliot, then flips what appears to be Two-Face's signature coin, asking if we get the joke. Aside from this being intended to make us suspect Two-Face as a possible identity for Hush, I'll be honest, I don't get the joke. If Hush is someone else, what's the humor in referencing Two-Face, aside from the vague idea of him being related to the justice system? Maybe he's saying beating the Joker was a twisted form of justice, in the same way Two-Face was twisted from his original path. Or maybe he was implying it was a coin toss as to whether or not Batman would have killed him. We'll come back to this scene later since it's important. Later, Joker is back in Arkham Asylum and gets visited by someone who appears to be Hush. He claims to be Joker's attorney, who just got him out on bail. Then he removes his bandages to reveal he really is Harvey Dent, who's undergone extensive plastic surgery to return his face back to its original form. Of course, this is presented from behind in a way that still casts doubt in your mind as to whether he's really who he says he is. This could all be a callback to Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns from 1986, which featured a Two-Face whose face had been corrected in the same way, lashing out against the world who thought they could fix the damage inside of him just by correcting his exterior cosmetically. He went back to his criminal ways, donning a trench coat and wrapping his head in bandages. Intentional homage or not, Hush is not the first Batman villain to sport a wrapped up head like this, but he's definitely the guy to own the look, at least nowadays. They have a funeral for Thomas Elliot, and Batman vows to find out who really killed him if it wasn't the Joker. Eventually, the Huntress appears again, under the influence of Scarecrow's fear toxins, and begins attacking Catwoman, who's been having an ongoing romance with Batman throughout this whole storyline. He arrives to put a stop to the madness, but they end up in a graveyard where they buried Jason Todd, the second person to take on the title of Robin, who was killed by the Joker in the 1988 storyline A Death in the Family. This event hangs over Batman as his greatest failure, but some of the pieces of this puzzle are starting to come together, as Hush appears before them for the first time. Batman first met Jason Todd in Crime Alley, the same place his parents were killed, and where his zipline was cut at the start of the story. Jason was caught stealing one of the wheels off the Batmobile, and that same tire was shot off in issue 3 of this storyline. Everything is pointing towards one thing, and just like that, Hush slices the bandages from his head, revealing he is indeed Jason Todd, somehow back from the dead. This was a shocking twist at the time, enhanced by the fact that we're seeing him aged up in a sick new outfit paired with the blood red sky. Having Jason return as this vengeful figure is a great concept, attacking him using the guilt he feels over not being able to save him. There's a reason Jason Todd's costume is displayed standing tall as a constant reminder in the Batcave. As Batman grapples with his own remorse, he eventually reassures himself that this can't be true. Because even at the end of his life, Jason knew how much Batman loved him and how he'll never be forgotten. This is a beautiful tribute to this long-departed character whose death was controversial. And Batman was right since he begins dissolving, revealing himself to have been Clayface all along. This moment with the revived Jason Todd was received so well that they ended up making it stick for real a few years later in the storyline Under the Hood from 2005. The justification given would be that he was revived by a Lazarus pit sometime earlier and got into contact with Hush as a way to get back at his former mentor. They retcon it so that it really was Jason Todd during the first half of this fight before he secretly switched out with Clayface for the finale. Not only is this style of retcon groan-worthy, where something conveniently happens off-screen which completely changes the context of an ongoing scene, but it also diminishes the emotional resonance of Batman's final words, assured in the belief that Jason knew how much he cared for him. Nah, he really was pissed at you for letting him die, and now he's gonna continue being a villain, exacting his revenge until eventually becoming an anti-hero when the DC universe was rebooted. Well, within the context of the Hush story itself, Jason Todd is supposed to be dead, and even if he wasn't, it was still a fake-out since he isn't the real Hush. Unfortunately, the actual reveal feels far more rushed and by extension, falls flatter. In just a few pages after the fight with Jason Todd, we jump days into the future, where they've arranged a meeting with the only person they think could have installed an electronic relay system they found in the Batcave earlier in the story. It turns out this could have only been placed by Harold. I'm not familiar enough with Batman's universe to know who this is, so it doesn't have any kind of impact on me. Turns out he's a mute mechanic Batman rescued from a life of crime and gave a job working in the Batcave years ago. Hush came to him and offered to fix his voice and body in return for creating and installing the relay in the Batcave, since he knew where it was and had easy access. What makes this betrayal even stranger is how it's the very same page that they even say who he is that he's being shot in the head right below, which was hard not to look at when first turning the page. The person firing those bullets is the real Hush finally appearing before Batman, wielding two handguns and quoting more Aristotle. They begin to throw down, and he eventually notices a jade pendant hanging from Hush's neck. This of course leads you to make the connection that he's secretly been Thomas Elliot this whole time. But at first, Batman is in denial, not wanting to accept that his childhood friend would betray him like this. But why would he do this in the first place? He reveals that this is the same bridge that his parents had their accident all those years ago. Initially, Batman thinks this has to be revenge over Tommy's father dying, insisting that Thomas Wayne did everything he could to save both of his parents. But Hush hits him with the opposite motivation, revealing that he was the one who cut his parents' brakes and insisted their normal chauffeur stayed home that night. He was attempting to kill his own parents, and that plan was thwarted by Bruce's father saving his mother. Because she survived, he had to wait years before she died of cancer so that he could inherit their family's fortune for himself. He says he's jealous of Bruce for losing his parents because all that money was then his. Obviously, this makes Hush a dark reflection of Batman's own origins, someone who came from a rich family who actually wanted to lose his parents, caring only about money and self-interest, while losing his parents was the single greatest tragedy of Bruce's life, changing its trajectory completely and causing him to vow to rid the city of the evil that took their lives. But something is off about this reveal, and that could be for a number of reasons. First, the way Hush finally gives his explanation for why he's doing this, and it's crammed into the bottom panel of the page, just seems strange. This seems so significant that you'd think it would get more room to breathe, with a larger, more dramatic panel dedicated to it. Second would be the fact that he never actually takes off his bandages, which only exist to hide his face until this reveal. We know what he looks like, and the whole time we're waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it never does. It's possible they wanted to leave things open to change his identity or appearance in the future, but it still diminishes the impact of this finale. Third, Hush's motivation is just extremely weak and far-fetched. After all of this work and build-up, the final reveal is that this guy, who is already a rich and famous brain surgeon, was just an unimaginably bad apple who would kill his own parents just to get money a little bit earlier in his life. He just suddenly threw away his affluent lifestyle and successful medical career to pursue this jealous vendetta which he has no reason to be holding on to decades later. Now, Hush and his backstory would be expanded upon significantly in future appearances, but I'm just appraising his character based on the context we're given in this first story, as he was originally conceived. While the location on the bridge does have significance, something about the way he just shows up with 2 pistols and starts blasting at Batman also feels too sloppy given how much thought he's put into this plan. I also feel like the character needed a much more signature form of weapon. Nothing too high concept, but 2 pistols just feels too generic for me personally. The bandages do tie into his medical background, but I think it would have given him away if he was using medical equipment as weapons. It also must be stated that it isn't that surprising that the identity of this newly introduced villain is the only other newly introduced character in the story. He really should be one of the first people you suspect, though his fake death should obfuscate that for most people. At the same time, it's hard to look at the way Hush talks and acts and attach that to what we saw of Tommy in the first half of the story. Of course, he's faking this affable persona while getting chummy with Bruce so that he isn't suspected, but the way he's grinning while shooting like a madman just makes him feel like a totally different character, diminishing the impact of this reveal. Well, Hush is able to incapacitate Batman, stating that his plan is to unmask him in front of everyone at Arkham Asylum. But Two-Face suddenly shows up and shoots Hush twice in the chest, sending him over the edge into the water down below. Now, this requires a bit of an explanation. Hush had come to Two-Face with his plan and agreed to fix his face in return for his participation. Two-Face would frame Jim Gordon by shooting a fake Thomas Elliot in the alley using his stolen service pistol. That fake Tommy getting shot would be Clayface in disguise, giving him 2 appearances in this story. So when we see Hush watching from above flipping a coin, that could really be Two-Face, who would have a reason to be there while also concealing his identity as a double for Hush. Joker's inclusion here is a bit confusing, but it's stated that he was in on the plan as well, likely positioning himself there near the fake dead body to cause Batman the most mental torment. At the same time, I'm sure Hush would have enjoyed seeing Batman snap and break his no-kill rule then and there. The surgery brought Two-Face back to his senses as Harvey Dent, which is a little funny because it's the exact opposite outcome of what happened in The Dark Knight Returns. This causes him to break his alliance with Hush, betraying him by shooting him and saving Batman. When they search for Hush in the water below, they can't find him, which can only mean one thing for comics: he survived. Sometime later, Batman returns to the Batcave to review everything that's happened. Turns out Hush had paid for the Huntress's new costume and gear, ensuring she'd be there to save Batman when he fell at the start of the story. Then he checks out that relay system Hush had Harold install in the computer. It was designed to flash subliminal images of Thomas Elliot so that eventually, when Batman needed surgery from the fall, the thought would come to him to request Thomas perform the job. Then, while in surgery and having access to Bruce's skull, he installed a tracking device in his head, allowing him to monitor and strike at him as needed. Superman helps him burn this out of his head to put an end to that. The last piece of the puzzle comes in the form of the Riddler, who had come to Thomas Elliot with a terminal brain tumor. He then used a Lazarus pit to cure himself and attempted to sell this cure to Tommy since he knew his mom died of cancer. Knowing the Riddler was from Gotham, Tommy must have let it slip how much he hated Bruce Wayne. An added effect of the Lazarus pit was the clarity for the Riddler to realize Bruce Wayne was Batman. So he gave him that information and they began plotting this whole ordeal, bringing in the other villains like Scarecrow, who began singing Hush Little Baby, which is where the alias came from. It was just a joke at first, but ended up sticking, especially since the song is about a kid who can't be satisfied, tying into Hush's motivations. I feel like this scene could have been better executed, maybe with visuals actually showing what's being described, which would have helped sell some of the more absurd concepts like the Riddler suddenly knowing Batman's identity after using a Lazarus pit. The comic ends with Batman breaking things off with Catwoman after she says hush, causing him to freak out, showing the lasting effects this villain has had on him. Overall, Hush has a few great things going for him. His aesthetic with the bandages and trench coat is really appealing and draws you in, making you want to learn more about him. But when you unwrap him, you realize all of that supposed mystery was all for show, and he's a much simpler character than you were led to believe. With how great the art is and how well written the dialogue and inner monologues are in the rest of the story, it's still an enjoyable read. It's just not as great of a mystery as it's propping itself up to be. Like I mentioned before, future writers were able to take the disparate puzzle pieces set up here and form a greater picture using a few pieces of their own. The issue is, he first needed to flounder a bit in a few aimless appearances where writers weren't really sure what to do with him. Since his storyline was so well received, of course they wanted to keep utilizing him. But he's a character whose motivations are solely tied to taking down Bruce Wayne, so he just doesn't work running around pulling off petty crimes around Gotham. Each appearance has to be significant, something Hush has been planning for years, ensuring they're pulled off without a hitch. But I guess it's part of the deal that once you become a Batman villain, you've gotta expect to be reused and placed in random situations as a nuisance. So he was tied into several plot lines that felt totally out of character, including wanting revenge on the Riddler and throwing him off of a building, getting involved with gang war politics with the Joker and Black Mask, teaming up with this guy Prometheus for no real reason who he has to perform emergency surgery on twice, with the second including him escaping the clutches of Talia al Ghul, trying to gaslight Poison Ivy into falling in love with him and getting mad when she turned herself back human, then just letting her die, getting Catwoman to steal a captured Clayface, and then later teaming up with another one in hopes that he himself can be turned into a Clayface, using the cover of Man-Bat to create a copycat killer to ruin the business deals of Black Mask, and finally Joker sticking a pacemaker in his leg so he can give him heart attacks with the push of a button. All of this before the character was revitalized by writer Paul Dini of Batman the Animated Series fame during his run of the comics in 2008, with the storylines Heart of Hush and the following Hush Money and House of Hush, before the universe was rebooted with the New 52 in 2011. Now, I read all of this and originally intended to include everything significant made before the reboot in this video, but I've decided to split it and cover the rest in 2 follow-ups since this one has already gotten this long. Heart of Hush especially really elevates his backstory and motivation, and transforms his central gimmick into something much more iconic. This storyline should also feel much more appropriate if you're someone like me whose first exposure to the character was through the Arkham games. This story actually had an animated film adaptation in 2019 as part of the ongoing DC animated movie universe. It features a number of tweaks to the story, including an extremely significant one where Hush's identity is changed completely. When the Riddler uses the Lazarus Pit to heal himself, he's also driven insane, killing the real Thomas Elliot and creating a new persona for himself called Hush. Now he has red eyes, sharp teeth, and a giant question mark scar on his forehead. Now the character is based around the Riddler's insecurity about being considered a third-rate villain in Gotham, which eliminates all of the ways Tommy tied into Batman's backstory and contrasted his personality and beliefs. Then he's dropped into a giant furnace at the end, meaning instead of having 2 interesting villains, we now have none. You know, until one of them is revived somehow. This is just an odd reinterpretation that doesn't change things for the better. It just feels like it was done to maintain the surprise, since most people watching this would have already known the twist. But at least it's doing its own thing over there and isn't overshadowing the original Hush storyline's legacy. Speaking of which, in 2022, for the 20th anniversary of the original comic, they ended up creating a short 5-page epilogue that showed a bit more of what happened to Hush after he took a dive. Batman finds a sunken boat that Hush escaped to where he removed the bullets from himself. Then we see him swim ashore where Harley and the Joker are waiting for him, looking to get what he promised them for participating in his scheme. This also gives us a better look at his outfit without the trench coat. Something I find really funny about his design is how he has a big H for Hush on his chest. When Jason Todd appeared earlier in the story, he had the same outfit but with an R instead, which is typical for a Robin costume. Even though Jason Todd was probably dressed like that as a play on Hush's normal outfit, because we saw him wear it first, it ends up making Hush's outfit with the H feel like the derivative. In this new appearance, you can also see his design has been tweaked a little, with the bandages creating an X across his face, which wasn't a thing in his original appearances. I suppose it's meant to symbolize his anonymous nature, with his identity crossed out. But it's also more in line with how he looks in the sequel storyline Hush 2, which started in early 2025 and I'm sure this epilogue was meant to lead into. A short prelude to this new arc was included at the end of Justice League Unlimited #1 from the end of 2024, showing him planning something big with little figurines of everyone he plans on manipulating. I'm really not sure where they're gonna take him with this story, but the fact that they're calling it Hush 2 and bringing back the same creative team implies this is meant to be the real deal follow-up. Considering all the timeline reboots since his introduction, I wonder if this is gonna factor in everything that's happened to him during the Paul Dini run, or if it's gonna act like this is a direct sequel to the original story and nothing else happened in between. The fact that revived anti-hero Jason Todd is one of his figurines shown in the prologue should result in something interesting. Let's hope this story can stick the landing with less of an anticlimax. But in the meantime, stay tuned for a follow-up taking a closer look at what they did with him when he started reappearing in the mid to late 2000s.